Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob here with Stan. And Stan, today we're talking about crisis management. With all the different cybersecurity incidents that have occurred out there, we have to also consider how you properly communicate. And so let's reach out to the world of PR and communications and understand how they can help translate some of the different issues to account for and identify gaps in crisis communication plans as it relates to the cyber aspects, the breaches and occurrences there.
You're absolutely right, Rob. I mean, I do think that it's important to have a plan, to know what you're going to do. And there's nobody better to talk to than those that actually lead that whole area around PR and communications. So our guest today is Kevin Dinino. Kevin is the founder and president of KCD PR, a top-ranked PR firm. And before establishing his own firm, he was the vice president of public relations at LPL Financial, the nation's largest independent brokerage firm. There he led the PR department and strategized communications for the executive team. And Kevin has an extensive background with PR, which enabled him to develop key relationships and secure media coverage for a lot of the major outlets we all know, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today, Business Week, and CNBC. Kevin, it's great to have you with us on the show. Anything else you'd like to add about your background or any of your current projects?
I appreciate the intro. I'm great to be here. I think you've done a great job on the bio. I've probably spent 20 years now independently running KCD PR, and I'm active with the Cyber Center of Excellence here in San Diego, California as well, serving on the board too. So kind of bring a communications background and know enough to be dangerous about cyber.
That's a good combination. That's why we're here today, because we all know that effective communication is crucial when you're dealing with a crisis in cybersecurity, especially. And so when you're trying to maintain that and manage your reputation and minimize the impact to the stakeholders, both internal and external, can you sort of describe those key elements that you should be thinking about in a crisis management plan? And could you also explain how those elements differ when you're in a private company and then when you're in a public company?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I think at the highest level, planning in general, when involved in a business really of any size, is going to be crucial. And so when it comes to how your brand communicates to audiences, understanding sort of the how, the who, what, where, when, and why as well are hugely important. So we'll start on the private sector side, and this could be a small business with 1 to 10 employees, and all the way up to a private company with hundreds or thousands of employees. But when you have a crisis communications plan, generally speaking, all business unit leaders are involved. And typically, if there's a head of communications or a head of public relations, that person kind of has a key seat at the table as well. But very much view it as, a business unit lead type thing. If it's a smaller business, it's pretty much the owner of the firm and maybe all of the employees. And so taking a step back, though, when you think about communications planning, a lot of it is who are our audiences. So private sector audiences tend to be employees, first and foremost, customers, vendors that you interact with as well, and then we will say the general public and media. That's a good, pretty much a standard 4 or 5 audiences. I'm sure there's more nuance to that. And then the planning really involves if X happens, and with a breach, it's not even if anymore, it's when a breach happens.
Exactly.
Here's what our communications roadmap is going to be. Here's who's in charge of communicating to this audience. Here's the method or medium of communication. So in the example of Sony, for example, they were brought to their knees to only communicate by text with each other in general because of that hack. So detailing how you're going to communicate, what is the manual process? If it's media, what is our statement? But I think the biggest takeaway is communicate. Have a plan, communicate. Too many companies don't do anything and then they get bit. And I think to give you kind of a quick tidbit on publicly traded companies, you add obviously a lot of nuance and sophistication to that audience structure from a planning standpoint. Typically, you would have a head of investor relations or somebody involved in investor relations that would be communicating to Wall Street as a whole, shareholders, various investors in the firm. For example, media probably becomes a bigger priority as well in terms of getting in front of talking to media. And I'd say probably just the scale of employees, customers, vendors is likely going to be larger. So segmenting it out, whether you have, let's say, regional or divisional leads in certain categories, they would then be in charge of certain communication. But again, it's building the message structure. What is our message? What is our process? Who are we talking to? What are we communicating? And then how are we communicating, with that as well? So I think that's a high level.
I would imagine the type of incident, though, would also dictate some of that. For example, ransomware might be a different kind of response than if you had some kind of just exploitation occurring. I imagine that's the case, right?
Correct. So ransomware, probably a little bit different. If there's a financial issue, meaning money's missing or customer data or vendor data is missing or was breached, that's a different kind of group of comms versus, let's say, if you're a utility and, public and client data was accessed, but also it becomes more of a security threat as well in terms of like actual physical security too. So very much case by case in that regard.
Yeah, depends on the situation. And I think you called out, a good example of that from a public perspective too. It's a whole different ballgame, much more sophisticated. One of the things, Stan and I have talked about this in previous episodes, and we've had some folks come on and kind of share experiences of positive outcomes relative to tabletop exercises, Kevin. And so, that in essence, the crisis communication plan is part of going through a tabletop exercise. You need to know what the communications are going to be like, who the different stakeholders are going to be, get the succinct message out everyone agrees to. But I think, one of the things that'd be interesting to hear from you is when you have had experiences maybe or with tabletop exercises or something else like that type of scenario, what are the examples that you've seen that drive efficiencies? We, for example, had some conversations where, one of the tabletop exercises led to basically a layer of executive management being pulled out of having to make that decision on the action that should be taken when and if a similar type of event happens. Because they exercised and they saw and they said, there's no reason for you to have to come to me to get approval to take that action. All I'm going to do is slow things down. Because we went through and learned this particular type of scenario, it's a great indicator for us to be able to be more efficient, pull that out. So something to that effect, as you've seen in the different experiences you've gone through.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And again, a little bit of nuance in terms of whether it's a tabletop exercise and you can kind of pull away from that in terms of, okay, our broader messaging is always going to be, specific to X when this happens, but being able to pull in probably core functions, communications folks, leadership, and if there's a CISO involved from a security standpoint, to really answer all of the technical questions, at least internally, when communicating that, and then having sort of the core group make the determination of how and what is going to be communicated. And that could be something as simple as notifying all those involved internally first, externally, getting out in front of it and talking to the media, providing a statement to the media, again, because you don't want to create chaos. And if the answer is we're not sure yet, simply just providing a statement saying, hey, we're investigating, a possibility of a ransomware hack, et cetera. But when you don't do something, particularly even worse on the public company side of things, the last thing you want your shareholder or investor base to find out is that there was a breach and they see it in a filing, and that can impact earnings, et cetera, as well. And now you're starting to even see certain industries, especially in the financial services space, like credit unions, where now they have to legally disclose to various regulatory bodies that a breach occurred and what their response was too. So those are a few examples, and I think you'll see more and more of that. But I think where you can give responsibility to your management team in terms of notifying, key audience, key stakeholders, and then really kind of executing on that crisis plan. And then typically, it tends to be sort of a trifecta, if you will, of CEO, head of comms, and CISO, likely as like the three prongs that are very much involved in terms of being able to kind of pull the levers or communicate from there.
I think one of the worst things that can happen sometimes, Kevin, is you have an incident and they feel empowered to communicate because you haven't been, pre-authorized, right? And so you don't know who is speaking for the organization, right? It's sort of like, is it Tom over here? Is it Linda? I mean, am I supposed to be saying something? I don't know. And so you end up with that kind of dance. And I've been in the CISO seat before, and I've had to oversee incidents. And I think one of the challenges is that you want to be proactive in communicating with the stakeholders, and you want to convey information. And I guess that everybody wants to know what's going on, because they, especially internally, where they want to know if they can help. They want the executives want to know what the exposure is, what the risk of the organization is. So how can you effectively give reassurances, especially, let's face it, many times I'm still dealing with the incident. I'm still trying to determine what's going on. And I don't want to also get too far ahead of over my skis, as it were, right? And share things that ultimately turned out to be inaccurate, because many times the initial impression of what's happening is not necessarily truly what has happened. And you don't want to lose your credibility by giving misinformation. But at the same time, you do want to be responsive. And you don't want to be just viewed as a stonewaller, right? So how do you strike a balance there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a delicate dance. And I think for a CISO, they're ultimately involved in trying to, either respond to or get into the technical analysis of what happened. And so many times, when you have these plans, things like holding statements become important, and they really kind of buy you time as well. And so having your comms team communicate to audiences that, hey, this is being addressed, whether it's looked into, here's what we found, et cetera. I think there's key points that you can communicate along the way of this is what's happened and be factual, but then to circle back on it and to communicate what actually was detailed. And I think that's the issue, is that when companies kind of go dark, it creates a little bit more opportunity, if you will, for all of these different audience structures to make assumptions, and then assumptions lead to various levels of change, whether it's customers leaving, employees leaving, internal resources calling media and leaking information as well when there's no statement too. And so at the very least, if you can have a point person who's able to communicate, here's our statement. If we are receiving calls from media, here's who to contact. Do not disclose any information. But again, it's just following protocols with that. But yeah, Stan, to your point, it is a huge challenge, because think of it this way: you've got, a large financial services organization, let's say, that's been breached. They have to disclose to a regulatory body. But to your point, what if it's a nation state or a group where, we know they're inside the network or a system, but that's the extent of all we know, and that nothing has been sort of thwarted or solved.
Right. There's still a lot of unknowns, and they want to have follow-ups. And it's like, well, I don't have that information yet. So there is that regulatory requirement, a certain number of days you have to say something, but I don't know how material it truly is yet, because I'm trying to figure that out. But I think, to your point earlier about organizations just trying to stay quiet and not share anything, we've seen the blowback, that has occurred. I think Uber was an example of that, right?
Yep.
That was a big one, where they try to keep it under the rug and under the carpet. Eventually came out, and it did not look good, to the executives that made those calls.
Yeah, that's a great example of that. Kevin, one of the things, let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into this area. You talked about some of this level of communication. So there's the internal and external communication aspect of things. What do you recommend as some of those kind of clear channel of communications? How do you approach that? One. Second is, as you just alluded to, one of the big concerns, especially for a public entity, is dealing with the media. So what are some of the best practices in that approach to deal with the media? You know, you mentioned it. If you're not communicating effectively, then bad news can't get out there, assumptions can be made. And again, it becomes very negative to be able to deal with the consequences of the fallout from those situations. So what are some of the kind of guiding principles that you, with your clients, recommend?
Yeah, I mean, some guiding principles would be building out a messaging matrix. So, regardless for any crisis, and, a cybersecurity breach, et cetera, is a big part of it, but there are crises of all kinds that impact clients. And so having a messaging matrix of, what are our defined brands messages in the face of any sort of crisis, and then who's responsible for communicating that. I mentioned holding statements. So with media, in many instances, you're likely, in most cases, responding to incoming inquiries as well. And so it's likely going to be a combination of providing what I would call in our world a holding statement, but it's essentially, a company statement that addresses what happens, but it's you're able to sort of message it on your terms and provide it proactively, as opposed to finding out after the fact as well. And so, it can even be broken down on the media side where, if there are, let's say, beat reporters in your vertical that are, intently covering your company and have been, covering, let's say, a crisis issue is one thing, but there's ultimately relationships that, have been built where they're covering the company consistently. So, again, if you go dark, it's going to set off the 3 alarm bell, and they're going to do more digging and find off as well. So I think the main thing is to provide, in many cases, it's damage control too. Provide the statement, be truthful, give all the facts where you can, and I know we've talked about this, whether it was Uber or even Target, there's, a litany of brands that have kind of not done this. But it's following that message matrix and really kind of sticking to a, in many cases, I don't want to say a script, but it's close to that. You've got approved messages that everyone can use, and you're in front of it, and you're reacting to it and providing statements to media so that they're not making their own assumptions.
Kevin, I imagine that the comms department wants to be the one that is the single voice to the media. But to your point, the media is going to be trying to find out what the heck's going on and reaching out to a number of people in the organization, right? How do you effectively communicate to your employees, to your contractors? Don't say anything to the press. We're doing it. Especially, let's face it, if your communications internally are compromised, you can't necessarily broadcast out an email, and potentially a bad actor is already in reading what's going on. I mean, so I guess there's 2 questions. One is, how do you control the messaging and that interface with the press in a way that ensures that the right people are the ones doing that communication? And the second question is, if you have comms that you suspect are compromised, how do you cope with that and effectively deal with a crisis?
Absolutely. Great question. So there's several ways to do this, but I mean, I think in terms of communicating with the media, oftentimes companies will have, let's say, a news or press center page with the appropriate comms contact. So having that as a starting point helps for sure. So the media knows who to contact as well. But then internally, having comms sort of address the issue, whether it's to the employee base and just saying, hey, here's the issue, here's who's responsible for handling it. That's where all that planning comes in handy. And then the medium of how you're pushing that out. So it could be email, it could be the intranet. If one or both of those is compromised, it could be setting up a toll-free number and having sort of a town hall. It could be reverting to texting. I mean, again, like there's going to be various levels of, if one is compromised, here's the next as well. And in the instance of Sony being hacked, in this case, I believe it was by China, they went to text messaging as well, completely getting off of, all network-based activities too. So I think that's part of it in terms of communicating to all of the audiences of who's in charge of this message. In many cases, on a practical level, what we're advising our clients on is, here's a statement, issue it to all of your audiences. If it's internal, it's, hi employees team, Kevin is here's what happened. If you receive any inquiries, please, send them immediately to this person, phone number, email address as well. And you just keep a log in terms of who the calls are and report back on that front too.
And again, imagine with the response team that is trying to deal with, whether it be the executives or the actual incident response team themselves, part of that crisis plan has to include alternative means of communication. And you need to make sure if you're going to do texting, you have to make sure you have the text numbers, the phone numbers to be able to do the text too. I mean, you don't want to be having to hunt down, oh, shoot, I have no idea what that person's number is. I don't normally communicate at that level, right? So that's another aspect of this, is making sure you have the means of actually communicating when you are in that crisis.
You have the means, having whether it's a text group, whether it's using apps, again, whether they're approved or not as well, but you can use apps like WhatsApp or Telegram, et cetera. I mean, there's varying levels of kind of connectivity and security, but yeah, it's exactly that. So that's where, again, all of that meticulous planning, there might be, a person involved with comms in an HR capacity of, here is our text group for, audience A of employee standpoint. If something goes out, this is how we're hitting them as a last resort. Or if the internet is hacked, where we would send people as well. Same thing on the investor or public side. Here is our microsite that we flip on should our public facing website be hacked and taken down. Yeah. So you have various backups in place as well. I mean, we've seen that happen with a client, a few years back where, their site was literally taken over by an ISIS support group, and it was just a dark black flag. And, within 10 minutes, we had a new site kind of backed up, ready to go as well. And so, that, again, it's not, to this day, and I think we could all agree on this, it's not an if this is going to happen scenario. It's very much more a when as well.
And in the cyber aspect of things, when we go through an incident, there's always that you're trying to obviously recover as quickly as possible from that, but you're also going to then go back and dig deeper, further investigate, and take the lessons learned to then map back into how can you better strengthen and identify the gaps you had, some maybe control mechanisms that weren't there that should have been there, and apply that. So it's this continuous loop. That same principle holds true as the examples that you're referring to, as we may have not figured out the best way to have backup communications plan. So the texting groups, different applications you can use, WhatsApp and Telegram, as you mentioned. I guess when you look at that kind of lessons learned, are there other areas that you should be considering, other examples maybe that you've gone through that you've seen that, hey, these are some things that we were able to pick up, because it's got to be part of the process, right? You closed off on the crisis management aspect of what's occurred, but now you got to go and decipher, basically understand what else do we need to do moving forward, not just for that client, because you have so many different clients, but it's part of your overarching strategy with others going forward.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. And I think a lot of it's similar to, I think when you see sort of a breach and you notice it, if you look at like the Olympic rings, the 5 rings, and you imagine that, and if you put it on a table and then you spill a glass of wine, a red wine, let's say, on a table, and you see the wine sort of slowly hit each rung, if you will. So it might be comms, legal, ops, HR. And so I think that's what we've learned, and is that notifying and involving key departments is a huge lesson learned, as well as similar to kind of network security and all those tabletop exercises. Who are the third parties that have access to things? And in many cases, if if it's a company where, let's say, it involves subsidiary or affiliates that might be communicating to media and other audiences, but ultimately it's let's say the parent brand involved. I think that's been a big lesson learned, and that the parent brand had their way of doing things, but then you had various subsidiaries, let's say, or holding companies that had a different way of doing things. And you really need to be aligned with the how, what, and when it comes to communications. And so, in that example, we had a subsidiary essentially giving one message to the press, to investors, while the parent company was giving another. And that's obviously not good as well. So this is where what you say and how becomes just so crucial in that regards.
I'm just curious, how do you rein that in? I mean, do you expect it to be top down, that the parent umbrella organization would be the one that would say, stop, this is how we're doing it?
Yes, that's what happened. But, if you view the audience matrix, let's say that we talked about at one company, just imagine that, for, okay, the comms and CISO for parent company should be talking to the comms involved at all of these,
Right.
subsidiaries. And if it's a more central organization where, let's say, the comms director is, responsible for the communications of, let's say, 5 or 6 different sub brands, et cetera, as well, then taking into account all of the different routes related to each of these brands. And when you go in a similar vein and do these tabletop exercises to look for weakness, it tends to be, let's say, a third party, relationship that's got access to a subsidiary's network or system, but then plugs into the parent. It's, that's always the exercise that we're doing. But it's, if you kind of reverse engineer it from a communication standpoint, I think it's helpful to understand sort of who's in charge of what as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Kevin, we appreciate you coming on. This is definitely an aspect of, obviously, the cyber world we all live in. We know that your world is obviously greater, broader when it comes to crisis management for different organizations that you have as clients of yours. We appreciate you putting the spotlight and kind of looking at it from that cyber lens and helping the audience also think about different aspects of what they should consider as part of their overall strategy for crisis management. And maybe they'll be reaching out to you in the near term. So thanks for coming on today, Kevin.
Appreciate the opportunity, gentlemen. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kevin.
Hello, producer Ben here, and you'd just heard Rob and Stan talk about previous conversations where tabletop exercises were on the agenda and their positive outcomes. For example, back in episode 2 of Reimagining Cyber, the guest was Jim Routh. He's had an impressive career leading cybersecurity programs for some of the largest organizations in the world.
The head of enterprise risk for the company suggested a tabletop exercise for the executive leadership team. That's the senior executives. That would be the CEO and the CEO's direct reports. We decided to do a tabletop using this scenario, attacking one of our third-party advisors that distribute our products. And it turns out we went through it and we came up with 28 lessons learned that were all, really significant. And 2 of which, the first one was that making a decision to separate the advisor from the network was paramount and needed to be done at the SOC level with no senior, leadership deciding that. Because of this time, because most of the damage is done in the first few minutes of a ransomware attack.
That was Jim Routh in episode 2 called Unconventional Approaches to Improve Cybersecurity. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Don't be shy to share the podcast with others who've got a keen interest in all things cybersecurity and cyber resilience. Goodbye.